On today's episode, Tom Kemp manages to hold space for both a deeply philosophical conversation while at the same time providing pragmatic advice for all of us working to figure out how the heck to make a living from the things we make. Now, I personally have never connected too much with the philosophy and the what is art conversations that often spring up in these spaces. But when he marries that side by side with the realistic and the pragmatic, the benefits of things like social media for artists to test out ideas in the marketplace, alongside the difficult slog that is practicing a craft and teaching your body how to physically do something new in order to express that what is art idea. Now, that is a conversation I could have had for many, many more hours than the length of this interview. So let's dig right into it. Welcome to the Maker's Playbook, the podcast where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. I'm your host, 12-year veteran self-employed artist, Rebecca Ikes-Skara. Hi, Tom. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here.
Thank you for making the time and dealing with all of our, the fun precursor of technology before actually starting these conversations.
Yeah, I know. We've been here for 4.5 hours now. You understand that, don't you? This is going crazy. I just thought we were here for a chat.
We really got to give people a good insight into what goes on into this. For people who don't know who I'm talking to, rather, how would you introduce yourself?
My name's Tom Kemp. I am an artist. I work with ceramics and in particular porcelain. I've had several different careers though, and only in the last, say, 5 years, I've become a full-time ceramic artist, potter, whatever the word is these days. And so I changed my life completely to do that, having had normal jobs before then, in tandem with learning to be an artist, but suddenly became brave and took the leap about 5 years ago. And so, yeah, I make my living making vases mostly. And is there anything else that I should say about myself?
Well, this is why I love not deep diving on the internet because, obviously I've been following you online for a bit of time. And I took a look at the bios you put out there, just a quick cursory, like, here's your website, basically. And I didn't realize that at all. I had kind of assumed you've been doing this for much longer than 5 years. So now this opens up a whole different path of conversation than I anticipated.
I first touched clay about maybe 12 years ago now, and I just went to an evening class where I'm looking for something to do that wasn't my normal thing, and just loved working with a wheel. I was terrible at it, like everybody else is when you start. But I had a little inkling that it was going to be something special for me. So yeah, I just went to classes, and I kind of taught myself really then. As soon as I discovered on YouTube, there were about 10,000 videos on how to do this, that, or the other.
All by Florian Gadsby?
Well, no, he's done recently he's done wonderful work, but at the time, we were kind of in parallel together for quite a long time. And then he shot up like a rocket. He's done amazingly well, beautiful stuff. And he does a lot of really good educational stuff. But in the day when I was starting, and so was he, we still had a lot of material to learn from. And I much prefer learning by myself than being taught. I was a terrible student, terrible pupil at school, smart ass and just trying to come up with the different answer than the teacher thought was the right answer, that sort of thing. Really annoying. And I've always loved just learning at my own pace, which is sometimes slower and sometimes faster. But the advantage of doing that is you get to learn from loads of teachers. So you get lots of different points of view. And somehow it all kind of meshes in your hands and your brain and turns into something that you couldn't have got anywhere else, apart from this very fragmented and very broad education. But it's got lots of disadvantages as well, though. So I know there's lots of stuff I don't know. So if I'd gone to a formal course, or I'd done an apprenticeship, or all the usual routes, the traditional routes to learning this stuff, I'd know a lot more about how glazes work. I'd know a lot more about the chemistry and the history of ceramics and all that stuff. It's all there to be learned, but once you're on the treadmill of getting to a point where there's something you want to make, things go by the wayside. And I never gave myself the chance to learn all the things I know I should have done. So probably when I'm, very old, I'll suddenly turn to all the basics I should have learned 20 years before. But at the moment, there's still too much to learn for what I want to make. So I'm happy.
Well, and I also found, I formally studied photography at university, and yet it wasn't until I was professionally practicing that I had so much more focus to figure out, like, oh, I want to deep dive on this aspect, or I want to learn, I learned what ISO does or what aperture or what shutter speed does in a very book sense of the action. But I
And
had
you could
no
listen.
idea. Yeah, I had no idea what I wanted my style to be, right? Like
Mm.
capital S style to influence those variables and all of that. I don't know. I think for me, I struggle with, it's beautiful that everything is so accessible and we're breaking down a lot of barriers, hopefully, slowly, gradually in the arts world for access to resources for people. And then at the same time, it is still really important to make sure there is for lack of a better word, I don't want to say quality control, but there isn't a certain way there's not a barrier to entry anymore. And so then trying to figure out, as a consumer, what's out there and why is this priced this way or that's that way. I'm opening up like 20 million cans of worms that we could go down into in
Yeah,
conversation.
no, no, I know what you mean. So learning for yourself is you have to be a lot more disciplined if you teach yourself. If you do, or you'll fall really flat on your face. Very, especially if you want to go professional, you can't not do it really well.
Yeah.
Learn things properly, and that's painful and it's slow. You make all the mistakes you could possibly ever make, which is great for teaching in the future, of course, because then all your students. They never surprise you because, oh yeah, I did that. Oh yeah, I've told that. Oh, that always happened to me. Yes, yes.
Saw
Here's
that
how I
coming.
fixed it. Yeah, that's right. So it's great for that. But yes, and yes, you can be a bad learner in all kinds of situations, and you can be a fake learner in an institution and kind of pass and do all right, and just be a bit mediocre in your learning and get through. And that doesn't work if you teach yourself. You can't be like that at all. You've got to be quite ferocious with yourself because no one else will. Everybody around you saying, "Oh yeah, lovely stuff. Oh, it's so cute." Oh yes, and oh yes, I'd buy that. I'd buy that. Of course, no one ever does because they don't really like it, but they can't say that, and so you have to be very harsh on yourself all the time. And that's a habit I've got into. It's very disappointing actually because then you're never happy. Every time I open the Kindle, it's oh well.
It is a tricky balance as far as just the mental health of it. You do have to occasionally appreciate how far you've come while also maintaining that standard. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes.
Was there a way, I'm curious, with learning so much on a platform like YouTube, what I found difficult when I was just getting started is I had no knowledge to understand what videos were actually good to learn from versus which ones were just teaching you horrible habits. Because there are well meaning people out there who are making tutorial videos that my husband's a production potter, that when he watches them goes, why is this person teaching anyone?
Yeah, yeah, because they've self-taught to be a teacher. They're teaching themselves to be a teacher, which is like the worst possible thing to do unless you're going to do that well. You're passing on all your badness to everybody else then. So before I ever touched clay, for several decades before that, I taught myself calligraphy, formal writing and sign writing, type design, typography. And that's what taught me how to learn. When you learn a craft, you're teaching your hands something, and your hands are very slow at learning. Not just your hands, by extension, your whole body. Whatever your craft is, archery, dancing, playing a violin, it all starts from the fingertips onwards, but it bypasses the brain, or rather, it uses parts of the brain that you're certainly not conscious of. In order to teach your body to do that thing very well, because it does it very slowly, because your hands learn very slowly, feels like nothing's happening for a very long time. There's a long plateau, mediocrity, very poor, like nothing's changing. You're just a bit, you're sort of okay, but nothing, you're not getting any better. And I didn't know that there was this long plateau you had to go on. And during all that time, it's a bit like when you're asleep, all sorts of things happen in your brain that you just don't know about. But if you didn't sleep, not only would you not learn those things, you'd die. And you have to you have to trust your body to learn those things, giving you the best possible environment you can and the best tools and the best circumstances. But then you just have to let your body learn. And in learning calligraphy, I understood how this works. And after that long plateau, you suddenly get a huge leap in performance, in your ability, in your skill levels, in your understanding, in your ability to move on to the next thing very quickly, and then again and again. And that plateau never turns up again. But unless you go through that plateau and you're willing to put that time in and realize that it's okay that nothing's happening, because it's all happening. You just can't, you just don't be so arrogant that you should understand and see yourself learning. It's all happening inside you, then trust that to happen. And in the end, you'll launch yourself in wonderful ways. And I'm finding that's true of clay just as much as it was with brushes and calligraphy. So I'm much more patient now about learning and going through the pain right now, that long plateau now of making very large porcelain vases. That's the thing I'm at the moment. I'm making loads of mistakes. I had one today. It was a 3-section vase, and I did the first one fine, second one fine. Oh, 2 hours per section. I'm really speeding up. It's going really well. Third one, getting towards 6 p.m. and I have to come home to do this. And I don't know, something just, my hands just lost it. My brain wasn't there. Something, it just collapsed. The top just wasn't the right shape, and the whole thing had to be cut in half. And the whole day's work was completely wasted. And I'm absolutely fine with that, because I know that's just one more point along the way. Long, very boring plateau, that if I don't go along that plateau, I will never get to the point where I can do really good stuff. So I'm willing to put the time in to do that. And this is a very long answer to the question about, you asked about YouTube videos to watch or what not to watch. And can you spot a good one and a bad one? Yes, you can. You can absolutely spot the rubbish teachers who don't know what they're talking about and making all kinds of mistakes. Their body's wrong, their speech is wrong, there's no fluidity. They never bothered to go through that long plateau. They're just jumping along, trying to teach you something they think they've understood. Yeah, there's loads of people like that out there. And they should take a step back and learn to teach properly. Take a lesson from people who can teach well, because there are plenty of those too.
Yeah, and so many of the teachers who have been teaching for decades and have that experience behind them, I find, are starting to dip their toes into online teaching and ways to make what was otherwise quite inaccessible in terms of, how many people have the resources to go off to wherever in the world or wherever in their own country even and spend a weekend or a week or a month or a
Yeah.
year apprenticing or workshopping under someone. It's really impossible. So that's what's so wonderful about the internet. But at the same time, you know, when you are just dipping your toes into it, maybe you don't want to sink $1,000 into a workshop or what have you. And it's so tricky because on the one hand, all of us are out here saying artists need to charge what we're worth and we need to charge what we're worth. And that's 100% true. And then at the same time, that limits an amount of accessibility to a certain group of people who can afford that, and all of these different levels of how complicated life is. But oh my goodness, I'm writing down notes as you're talking, also in terms of just the recognition of learning in the body is it's something I haven't thought that much about, and also brings to mind a completely kind of tangential topic in the sense of how much of our life's experience compound on each other, right? I find that so many of us, as you pointed out at the very beginning, we touch clay and now we're obsessed and we want to go straight down the rabbit hole into doing more of that and then feel so behind and wish we discovered it sooner or wish we had pursued this craft when we were in our 20s and we loved it, but we thought we had to do a different career for security or all these things, not realizing the disparate stuff is what brings together something unique. I mean, the first thing I noticed I don't remember how I saw your work on Instagram, but I did.
Mm.
And the very first thing I noticed is this, physicality of slapping a brush onto a very delicate piece of pottery that I
Mhm.
don't know many other people can do. And that clearly comes in connection with your experience with brushwork and calligraphy before that you wouldn't have otherwise had.
Oh, yeah, it was totally deliberate. My very first lesson with it on a wheel was I could see the things I wanted to make. I'm still not quite making them yet because I'm to the scale I want to be. But for sure, my very first pot, which I still have, is a horrible orange bowl, but it's got red written marks around it. And the written marks are much better made than the pot, but that's because I knew what I was doing with the brush. And so my pottery is trying to catch up with the understanding I have of writing and all that fluid movement that my hands really do understand very well, but only through sheer, number of hours of doing a thing again and again. Once you've done your 10,000 O's, you can do that pretty well. There's no magic to it at all. The magic is having the persistence to go along that plateau. If there's one lesson I'd teach everybody, it's just stick to that plateau and enjoy the fact that your body is learning what to do, despite you even sometimes. And make sure you just stay on it, because it will get to an end. It always ends, and it always ends going up vertically. When I say that, I just mean sort of the experience of it. The rate of learning goes up. Everything accelerates hugely after a certain length of time. And the question is, how long is that length of time? Well, that's just a function of how many hours you put into it, how much repetition you do of the right thing. So yes, you can repeat the wrong thing many times and never get anywhere. And the way you know what the right thing is, you do in pottery. Everybody's got their technique in whatever craft it is, and in pottery, it's you cut the damn thing in half. And that's all it is. You just cut the damn thing in half and see where the clay went. And if it
Yep.
didn't go where you think it should have gone, well, then next time do another one. And then cut the damn thing in half and see if the clay went the right way this time. Especially the good ones. Cut the really good ones in half just to prove to yourself that you're learning properly. And that's what the plateau is. Every craft has their own way of cutting the thing in half, but whatever it is, you need to do a reflective learning during that process. And that's so our reflection, when we start with pottery, for example, and I mean on a wheel. So I don't do hand building, for example, but on a wheel, our reflective practice is involved in where did the clay go? Because it's so hard to know. Those fingertips, especially one that's inside, you can't even see it. I'm rambling about this. I don't know where I am now. What are we talking about?
That's okay, because what people can't see is me nodding along emphatically, like, yes, this is the thing. Because I was just having this conversation with a woman that's in our membership community about, that so many of us fall into, and guilty as charged, I did this. You touch clay, you get obsessed, you start making these very physical items that start taking up a lot of space in your home. And if you have a smaller home, you don't have any space and you want to keep making and keep practicing. So therefore, you start selling the stuff before perhaps it should be sold, before it's really, the quality that,
I'm guilty.
yeah, absolutely. And, she was saying, well, I don't want to stop making. So I feel like I have to do something with it. I can't just keep it all. And I pointed out, like, well, who says you have to fire it? Like, you can keep practicing and cutting it in half. There's nothing that will improve, will drive you to improve more and faster in many ways than doing that. And also kind of learning a little bit of that detachment, I think, from our work, because there's also nothing more painful than cutting the best ones in half, but it was kind of this light bulb moment of, oh, like, yes, there are so many steps of this process we can practice without finishing. And that still drives the needle forward to improve. And then it relinquishes the stress of, okay, now I have to sell this stuff because it's filling up my closet, or, whatever space you have in your dining room table, and you need to eat dinner.
Yeah, that's right. One way of thinking about this is, again, this came from my calligraphic understanding, is the objects that we make. So coming back to the sort of preciousness of those early ones, we're just so overwhelmed that this thing even made it out of the kiln. It's a genuine being, almost a living being that we can't possibly destroy or get rid of. And what I understood from calligraphic learning was it's much better to treat, it's much more useful in the end to treat those objects that you make as mere evidence of your learning. In other words, the thing that you're doing, the thing you're making really is yourself, is your body. As I keep saying, you're teaching your body something. That's the thing you're making. You're producing a better you. And the pottery is just, it's a mere means to that end. And each pot is just, it's an expression of how well you're doing in that benefiting yourself. So if you can get to that state of mind, then as early as possible, then each pot doesn't really matter. And I find that a lot with potters, that they don't worry too much about their pots. It's other people who really care about them. Potters they're not that worried about the pots themselves. Each individual pot, especially for a production potter, for example, where it's very difficult to remember 3,000 mugs ago. That one mug I made, that doesn't make sense even to say that sentence to a production potter. That's not what they're into it for. They've got a whole other thing going on. I'm not a production potter, but I understand that, because I am a production calligrapher in a way, because every letter has to resemble the previous one fairly closely. And the joy, the real being of the thing is in the writing of the thing, is in the doing of the thing. The final letters I don't care about. I really don't. They're not interesting to me. It was the real-time moment of them being created which was important. So the pot itself is evidence of that process I went through. And for me, it's important that evidence exists, but I don't treat it as a precious thing in itself. I treat it as a precious emblem of what it gave me in learning to make it, if that makes sense.
I really love that idea. I have no follow-up thoughts, but I've just never thought of it in that way. That's beautiful. There was one other thing I just wanted to hit the nail over the head, or the whatever the phrase is. I can't think of the phrase I was thinking of now, but in terms of, you mentioned reflective practice, which makes me think of a phrase I had a music instructor tell me many, many, many years ago, because the phrase in the States, at least most English speaking countries, is practice makes permanent. And my instructor said that is an incorrect sorry, I think I just said it the correct way. So the phrase most people say is practice makes
You really
perfect.
blew that line, didn't you?
Yeah, I really messed that. The whole presentation of that just got complete. The delivery is off entirely.
I've got a friend who tells jokes, but she's so funny. She can never get to the end because she's just laughing so much by the time she gets to the punchline, and we never get to hear what it is, which is hilarious in itself. Sorry, let me have another go.
Here we go. All right. So the traditional phrase is practice makes perfect. But in reality, it's practice makes permanent, right? Because if you are, as we were talking about some of those online educators, if you don't have that reflective piece that you mentioned, the piece that gives you the feedback to know how am I doing? Am I actually improving?
Yes.
Then you're just, permeating those bad habits and making it harder to get out of them. Whereas if you get that feedback loop, whether that be from a traditional educational system or a community studio or cutting all of your pieces in half to give yourself your own feedback, whatever it is, all of those things combined, then you can actually increase your chances towards perfection, I would say.
Yeah, I don't normally moralize about pottery because it's one of those moral crafts going. I mean, you're not talking about, oh, you must do it that way, or you must, when they did it 100 years ago, they did it this way. Oh, you must do it that way. I can't stand all that, especially being self-taught. So I don't have any, no, I'm not following anybody, and I don't care what anybody did in one particular place or time or one point. If I like it, I'll use it if I can. But there's a little bit of moralizing about learning this stuff, though, which is it's kind of you can be quite if you don't reflect on what you do, you're either being lazy or you're being scared. And first of all, don't be scared because it's just clay and your time. It's only those two things. And if you bother to take the time to learn this stuff, well, then clearly you want to put your time into this. And so use your time wisely. And if you're being lazy, well, then stop doing this right now because you'll never get good. You'll always, as you say, repeat the same bad things again and again because it's just much easier to do that than to step back, crush the thing, learn what you've done wrong and what you should do right, and move on to the next. You've got to learn to enjoy the process of being disappointed. Does that make sense? You've got to learn to enjoy cutting the thing in half, and like a scientist almost, where when it goes against what you know, when you just discovered something and it goes against what you totally believe is true, a really good scientist will say, "That's fantastic. I've just discovered something I didn't know. What I thought was true is false. Therefore, I'm missing something. So what? Let me find the next thing. Let me find the real truth. I'm able to do that now." And that's what we have to do as craftspeople of all kinds have to do that too, which is disappoint yourself by cutting it in half or whatever it is and seeing what you did wrong and feel a little spark of joy that you discovered what it is that you did wrong. That's so much more enjoyable than pretending nothing bad is happening.
I like that balance between separating the learning piece of it separate from the craft and the do's and the don'ts and the arts and the functional and all of those different pieces.
Oh, it just drives me crazy. Yeah, that's that way of thinking. That's another good example of being lazy or scared. It's thinking like that. That there's this way to do it, and because my teacher did it, and my teacher's teacher did it this way, I have to uphold this tradition or that tradition. It's a nonsense. It's not how anybody truly does something new or interesting. It's a really good example of that, actually. Sorry, this is a complete tangent. I did a residence a couple of years ago in a Japanese pottery town, porcelain making town. And there's about 80 kilns there, 80 pottery studios or so. And they were looking around for a new kind of local design or something new to do because the industry was failing or just not as successful as it used to be. They were very hesitant to push any boundaries because there's such a strong tradition there, developed by a couple of people, especially one particular person in particular in the 50s, who came up with this new way of decorating porcelain pottery with a brush. And what I needed to point out to them was that the only way they were caught in a tradition developed by somebody who went against the tradition that he had. And that was a message. I've really thought about that a lot since then, of that tradition trap. A tradition only stays alive if you innovate in that tradition. It always dies if you just keep doing the same thing again, just like the repetition potter who never learns because they don't cut the thing in half. The complete tradition will die unless you almost go against it all the time. So suddenly there's a state of mind of working in a tradition and yet acting against it. Only in that way do you honour the tradition. If you go along with the tradition totally, you end up dishonoring it because it just dies a death. And it never becomes relevant again.
Well, I think that's the perfect segue because what I wanted to make sure I got to that I wrote down at the very beginning when you were introducing yourself was the number of different careers that you mentioned that you've switched along. And I'm assuming maybe that these things kind of connect together, that being able to iterate and change careers as needed and kind of follow, again, I'm going to put my own assumptions on and you can just correct all of this, but follow interests or passions or pursuits or whatever as they arise in a certain way has contributed to actually being able to have a long career as an artist rather than having that one style with a capital S and keeping that style forever and ever amen and never iterating thereafter because those were the things that sold at one given time or for whatever reason. I don't know. Does that connection make sense or is that only in the weird space of my brain?
That's a sensible point. It does make sense. I'm just trying to tease it apart in my head. Uh, so for a start, the first point is artists in general, just especially ceramic artists, make very small changes all the time along the way, but very small. So to the observer's eye, they're invisible. They can't be seen. So it may well look like a potter or a ceramic artist makes the same thing for years and years. It's like this. It takes so much experimentation to make the tiniest little change, and just 1 degree extra heat in your kiln can ruin a glaze. Just what this little smidgen of colour can completely ruin what was a beautiful blue. So because of that very sensitive nature of our tools and materials, materials and our mediums, we can't make great leaps in the same way that someone who uses acrylics, for example, does on a canvas. You can just splash a different thing and try a completely different manufacturer's paints or totally a bigger canvas, a smaller canvas. You can just have a go, and in 5 minutes you'll know whether it works or not, or whether there's something there to keep pursuing. We just can't do that. It costs a lot of money to fire a kiln. There's no way back. You can't recycle anything once it's been properly fired. You've got to be very careful about those sorts of things. And yeah, the huge number of tiny experiments you have to make to get anywhere different from where you are means it's a slow, conservative process, and you have to. I'm having to live with that. I didn't realise that when I started, and that's very different from the kind of abstract works that I do. So I'm lucky that I can play a lot more with my surfaces because of my previous calligraphic experience than I think I would have been able to do otherwise. I think I'd have been stuck in I don't think I'd have made very many new kinds of pieces or innovative work yet, because I would still be in that, one tiny little change here, one tiny little... And I quite enjoy that experimentation up to a point, but I get very frustrated too when I want to do something new. So that's one very important reason why ceramic artists seem to make no progress for a long time, even if it's really good. And on the other hand, I've got a desperate desire to understand something quite deep about us as human beings. And that's been going on for a long time since I started. I think since I started calligraphy. I mean, I keep mentioning this word calligraphy. Maybe I should explain what that is for anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about. People may think of calligraphy and they think of, say, wedding card invitations, or they might think of Japanese calligraphy, for example, Chinese calligraphy. Those are the two main things you think of. So Western calligraphy is sort of this functional, pretty writing thing, and Asian calligraphy, for want of a better, big, broad term, something like a tradition of writing that's been going on since writing started, and every child is taught to use a brush well, for example. So I have something in between those two, really, which is the brush writing tradition of Roman sign writers. So it's highly esoteric, this, but it does explain a lot about my work and what I'm trying to do. So I don't know if you've ever been to Rome.
My husband is Italian. And yes, I have been to Rome.
Anybody who's been anywhere in the Roman Empire, which stretched for many thousands of miles, of course, so will have seen many buildings with very large inscriptions above the ways, or, so-and-so paid for this. It's dedicated to whatever god. And we still have the tradition nowadays. So every public institution in UK, certainly in America, has a big sign at the top saying, Rockefeller Center or whatever it is.
I was going to say, ours are bigger. Our signs are clearly bigger than yours.
Well, of course, that's the one boast we can always have, isn't it? But the point was that tradition of putting those big lettered signs, or those inscribed, incised signs on buildings, came from the Romans, and those letters themselves, the really good ones, really good inscriptions, were handwritten with a brush, and those letters were then carved out with a chisel afterwards as a way of just keeping that handwriting in place. So all the really inscriptions are just examples of very good handwriting. They're not typographic. There's no perfection or anything. They're full of
Sure.
idiosyncrasies and mistakes. And for that reason, they look beautiful. They're full of life because they were written directly in real time with a brush. I learned that technique. In fact, I helped to rediscover that technique and wrote a book about it and blah, 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 and taught it all over the place. And got to the point where I really understood this brush, like really deep down in my bones. I get this brush totally. And that's the one I use mostly on like big pots. That thing you were talking about, slapping a pot, well, that's usually a very wide brush. That's the brush I'm using that would make formal Roman elegant letters. I do something a bit different with it these days. But the reason I do it is because it's so large and inescapable when you're using it that you can see in a really visceral way. I think I've used that word a few times now, but I really, it's with your viscera, you can feel and see not only the movement that's happening as the brush travels across the surface, but the feeling of it is immense because there's so much drag with such a large brush. There's an enormous amount of friction, especially on a bisque pot. It's clinging onto the brush as you go around, and you can really feel it. You can really feel the brush engaging with that surface in a way you can't with a tiny pen or other, or with the pointed brush, for example. You don't get nearly the same level of gutsy feeling of the thing working. And what I'm doing is I'm recording the time I take to make those very shapes in the mark itself, so that those marks become that I made them, yes, but they're also their very own record of their coming into being. And I love that idea. That it's very, what's the word? It's reflexive, but there's something very important I'm trying to discover or grab hold of about writing, which is not about the literate nature of writing, the fact that it means something, and the fact that CAT spells cat. I'm much more interested in the fact that we, as human beings, are just drawn to this. We can't not make our mark on the world. And writing's almost the pinnacle of that in terms of this, our sensitivity. The very, very tiniest little movements mean something to us. We get extremely good as children with those pencils they give us or those brushes they give us as children. They drill this into us day after day for year after year. So at the point, by the time someone's got to sort of the age of 10 or so, they're more or less professional calligraphers. Their hands have been forced to make so many thousands of tiny little movements that they are exceptionally skillful as craftspeople with these writing tools. Incredible level of skill. And I always think, what a total stupid waste of time. We're making our children do this. We spend all this energy and time of a child's life learning to do something that you can just tap on a keyboard now. Why don't we just abandon this writing thing altogether and spend all of that, and I'm not saying don't do something, but spend all of that time and energy on something the kid might actually enjoy. What about learning to be an archer? What about learning to be a dancer? What about learning to play whatever musical instrument? What about learning to be an orator? What about learning mathematics? Anything. Nothing in school is taught to the same level of degree by far compared to writing, where we insist on taking 5-year-olds, poor little 5-year-olds, maybe even younger. We force them. So I just think we should step back a little bit with children and say, hang on, if we really are going to torture them in this way, then we should put it to some good use rather than something which they're never going to use again. When was the last time most of us ever wrote an essay after we left school or anything apart from a shopping list? Honestly, it's nonsense to me. I think we can do a lot more for them. Anyway, that's definitely a side issue.
Well, it's funny to think about because I actually write in cursive, which I'm fairly certain people don't even learn that is being taken out of the repertoire, right? Kids learn how to sign their signature, but you don't have the depth of learning as far as, okay, you've learned your individual letters and now you're going to learn the difference between print and cursive.
Well, they've stopped teaching cursive. I'm so far behind where children are being educated. Really? They don't teach cursive anymore?
I don't think in the US, to my knowledge, and I have too many friends who are educators who are now going to come at me if they hear this and be like, Rebecca, this is wrong. So people do your Googling and do your own research because I'm not an expert on the matter, but I'm fairly certain many public schools in the US, because there's so much other material that teachers are kind of loaded down with for all the standardized tests, and that's a whole nother subject on a whole nother podcast, that the learning cursive as opposed to print is like this truncated, like, okay, here's the basics. Can you sign your name? Good. Let's move on.
Now I'm really cross because what you're saying now is they're not even bothering to get to teach this thing I've just been going on about. They're not even bothering to teach a child to do well in writing. Oh no, that's no good. That's no good at all. Unless they're thinking, well, let's ditch the writing and teach something more important. At the same level, though, the point is to do
Well,
it at
I
the
am
same level.
fascinated to know before we solve all the world's educational problems, we're going to at least have to pour a cocktail because it's much later for you. So it's just not fair to solve the world's problems. But before we go down that route, I'm fascinated to know how this transition from one career to the next worked because it sounds like you're quite a ways along if you were from education, you kind of glossed over it, which I laugh at a little bit because for any of us who have gone through a career transition, you can always tell when someone's like, yeah, that was the past and here I am in the present, and jumping over any what sounded like pretty significant accomplishments, maybe like writing a book is no small feat.
Oh, that wasn't a career. That was something else.
Amazing. Okay, so walk us through some of the kind of, to whatever depth that you would like, but some of those career transitions and navigating those because also, being a full-time artist is no easy feat. So navigating change can sometimes I'm putting my own stuff on it, but navigating change, at least for me, going through a career transition can feel quite scary because you're taking what little security you already had as a self-employed person and removing it completely and saying, okay, now I want to do this other thing. Is that, I don't know, that
Yeah.
might not have been your experience. So I'm just going to let
No,
you
okay,
take
so
it.
there's two things here. One is there's a third strand to my life or career, which is we'll get back into that in a minute. So yeah, so I had a normal job. I was, employed by an organisation, and we wanted to be a professional artist. And just what I mean by professional, I just mean making a living by just making stuff, not teaching it, not as a part timer, just making stuff full time. Is it possible? And I made sure there were three things that all came together, and it was sort of serendipitous, a little bit. It wasn't really planned. No, that's not quite true. It turns out my brain was planning it all the time. It didn't bother to tell me. So there was a moment when I was talking to my boss about something or other, about the way the company was going, and something snapped in me. Not in a bad, angry way. Just something changed completely in my head, and I realised at that moment. And I felt like I heard the words coming out of my mouth. I'm going to leave and do this thing for a living, this ceramics thing for a living. Like I saw the words come out of my mouth, and I watched them float over to her ear, and I fell back. I didn't mean it. But it was too late, and I said it. And the reason I was so confident I was able to say those things was, first of all, the company was taking a direction that I wasn't that happy with anyway. They wanted to do other things that weren't very interesting to me. But that wasn't it. That happens to all of us all the time. The second was I'd saved up enough money that I could afford to not have an income for a year. That was a deliberate decision to give myself that financial security. Eating baked beans, of course, not living the high life, but I could afford to live for a year, or maybe it was 9 months, but without learning a living. So the assumption was, assume you're not going to make any money, at least for a year. Assume that's true. How do you cope? And the third thing, the most important thing for me, was Instagram. So you mentioned Instagram a couple of times, and I was very lucky to get on it fairly early. I guess 7 years ago now, maybe I started on Instagram at someone's suggestion, and it worked for me. It was really crazy. I was putting things up, little videos of me writing on pots, and thousands of people flocked to it and liked it. And I think it was such early times that you could only have a video that's 15 seconds long in those days, and there just weren't that many makers on Instagram doing stuff. And I think people just like to see how things are made. It's fascinating. It's so commonplace now that you forget how much of a shock it was to see, oh my God, that's how that comes into being. I never knew how a teapot got made, that sort of thing. And just enough for people to say, I could happily watch this or follow this guy. And in those days, you could get crazy numbers. The biggest jump in followers I had was 4,500 followers in a day. Which is just, well, that happened about 4 or 5 times. And it's totally different now, completely different. And it's very different for anybody starting on Instagram now. It just doesn't happen unless you've got something exceptional going on that just resonates with people. And almost everybody will have a much flatter time on Instagram, much harder climb way than we did in those early days. But the point about Instagram was it was a way of me testing my things that I was making, my art. So first of all, does anybody want to buy it? If you're making things and no one buys them, you can't make a living out of it. It sounds so silly, but there's a lot of hopefulness. I'm crossing my fingers here. Hopefulness about, well, if I make these things, I'm surely somebody will buy what I make, and I'll be able to make some sort of living out of it. Well, with Instagram, you can actually test that. So I had an auction. I put an auction online, 5 fairly large pieces, to find out who wanted to buy my stuff, if anybody, and how much they wanted to pay for it. And I got 2 answers in that case. The first answer was quite disappointing. A lot fewer people wanted to buy these things than I'd hoped. It doesn't matter how many thousands of followers you have on Instagram, almost none of those people want to buy your stuff. So you have to bear that in mind. Very tiny proportion. But the second answer was really weird. The people who did want to buy it were willing to pay a lot more money. And that was a real shock to me. And it was that realization. I've got a fairly niche thing going on, but the people who do want it really want it. And I worked out that would be enough. If I could make enough pieces, I could sell enough to make my living. And that turned out to be true. But it was only because of Instagram's testing, the ability for me to test the market in that very direct way, without being really cheesy or feeling very kind of grotty about it. Because going to ask the market what they want is, first of all, it's really embarrassing. As an artist, that's the last thing you want to do. And also, you end up, it's so easy then to slip into making things what everybody wants. And the whole point of doing this is to make what you want. And what you need is that what you want matches up with what enough other people want. And that's all you ever need. Just enough people who want what you want, or who want what you want to make, to give you a living. And you've got to find those people. And that's what Instagram is so great at. It lets you expand yourself or your appearance to the world to the point where you reach all the people who want to meet you, want to find you. And you could never do that before. It was impossible to know how big your market was. And so I've got a very good idea now of what my market is. And I suspect there's a lot more out there who want it, but I haven't quite found the way to get to them yet. But Instagram's not that great for me anymore in terms of doing that. It's also flattened off a bit. But it was Instagram saving up money and being forced to go in a different direction that made me take the leap to being a full-time artist. So I can't stress enough. If there's a way for you to make that calculation of whether the finances will work, and it says yes, then that's a huge boost to be able to take the leap. Should I talk about my other career, or is it just too...
It's completely up to you, but my very pragmatic type A heart who just really wants to be an artist is bursting with joy because you've brought so much together that I find that I try and hit people over the head with in terms of the pragmatic side of look, you have to be willing to learn sales and marketing if you want to be a full-time artist. There's just, okay, you don't have to because you can partner with a gallery and make them do it, but then you have to be okay with losing that commission to them. It's all a give or take. Jackie Wright and I just had a conversation, particularly about Instagram, because she has grown so much just in starting hers a year or two ago and, kind of taking the photography course that I teach and having that confidence for the consistency of showing up online and whatnot. And she said the same thing that you just pointed to was approaching Instagram as an experiment, as this testing ground, instead of it being, oh gosh, I don't know, a platform of self-worth or whatever other myriad of terrible mental health issues it is, that it's literally just another place to kind of implement that scientist's mind.
Exactly. Yeah. It takes a while to understand that because, you love the likes, you love the love. And the dopamine, the gallons of dopamine I've had shot through my body because of this followers of blah, blah, blah on Instagram. It took me a while to sort of kick myself of that habit. I'm a bit bored of it now. And that's where you need to be with Instagram. You need to be a little bit bored of it. And then it's fine. It doesn't take over your life. It's just a way to get to reach people. It's just a communication channel in the end, rather than hey, look at me, everybody, I'm doing this, that, or the other. And if you can get to that point, then things are a bit healthier. But having said that, I definitely have been an Instagram junkie certainly to start with, because it was just too crazy. I'd never had that much attention for anything I'd ever done. I had an interesting conversation with someone who was a potter a few years ago now, and she'd been through the traditional pottery school. She'd done an apprenticeship, but she was very bitter about all these famous Instagram potters, and you mentioned Florian Gadsby, who's the Uber star. She was actually jealous. She was, we didn't deserve it. Now, in the case of Florian, that's not fair because he's also done the traditional learning route. He's done it thoroughly. He can't be faulted for the way he's learnt his craft. But there are plenty of others like me, little upstarts who learned online, putting our stuff online, selling online, making a career out of it. It's like it shouldn't have been allowed. She was moralizing. She was one of those
Yeah.
moralizers who,
Yeah.
unless you got your hands dirty, put your hours into whatever, I couldn't even be bothered to discuss it with her because she just wasn't in the mindset to understand what was going on here. That she was the one who was being lazy and fearful by not pursuing these new platforms and ways of marketing. As you say, you have to market somehow. And she just wasn't prepared to learn to do it, or she was just too scared of it, or something was stopping her taking advantage of something so obvious that I felt like sort of, slapping her around.
Wake up! Wake up!
Yes, exactly. Shaking her and saying, you are stopping yourself doing well. Nobody else is. It's not right. The fact that you're blaming other people for doing well on something that you're not even trying to do implies that you have a block in yourself about
Yeah.
this. It's not. And yeah, you could do even better than they could because you've been through all these, done these amazing teaching, learning, whatever it is that you're so proud of, but nobody knows about it. So what was the point? Unless you're satisfied in yourself of what you've done and what you've learned, if that's enough for you, it's fine. But if you want to make a living out of it, no, you've got to go and tell everybody else about it too and find out who wants your stuff.
I came up into photography right at the time when digital was fully replacing film. And there was an endless line of photographers who were so frustrated by, the young 20 something girls with their digital cameras who were like, oh my God, I love my job. And, guilty as charged, that was me. And there was so much bitterness because also in a certain way it had made it harder, right? Because you then had to learn. It was no longer the gatekeeping was gone in a sense that like with film it was very difficult to be like just for access to resources. It was hard to be a full-time professional photographer because you needed a dark room, you needed like all of these chemicals and chemical disposal, and so all these studios could have viable businesses purely because of their like gatekeeping on the resources that nobody else had available. But that didn't actually mean that you were providing a good service to people, right? And so now I find some of the flattening of the curve, if you will, forces us to really provide value to the people who are wanting to buy our stuff, right? It kind of, you have, like you were saying, to excel on Instagram now, you have to be providing something exceptional or really good at catching trends, but that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, I'm not into that at all. I mean, I'm the most uncool person I know, and I don't think I could never do an Instagram thing or a YouTube thing or whatever that relies on me being somehow trendy. That wouldn't work for me at all. Most people are. Most people have that. Are like that. I think most people aren't very cool. It's a big club. Most of us belong to it. And all that uproar about they're not doing it in the old way, and therefore it's not so good. That's rubbish. I can't see any difference between a good digital photograph and a good analog photograph. I can't see the difference. The difference between a good photograph and a bad photograph is enormous and is just the same as it always has been ever since photography began. We've had good photographs and bad photographs, and good photographers and bad photographers. And the means that you get to that photograph, I don't give a damn, actually. I don't care. I couldn't care less. It's like pottery. I can't be bothered with all this process. This process is good and that process is bad thing. Because in the end, you end up with the pot. And the pot's either good or the pot's bad, or the work of art is good or the work of art is bad. And it's really easy to spot the difference. And anybody who's clinging on to some process because of the process itself is probably not a very good artist or photographer or potter or whatever. It's a crutch for them. And you've got to feel sorry for people who have that. That's the thing they hang on to because they've forgotten, as in your case, in your world, that they've forgotten about it. This is about photography.
Yeah.
This is about painting with light. This is about something outside there. And in what happens in the dark room or inside the chip of the camera, nobody cares about. It's what happens between your eye and the outside world. Did that work? Well, we'll
Yep.
soon find out when it's developed. Watch out for yourself. If you're worried about process, then you're missing the point of the thing.
Well, and on the pragmatic side of it, I think, at least for my experience, having been self employed for over a decade, the absolute necessity, the kind of Darwinian thing of self employment is I think you are going to survive and you are potentially going to excel if you are willing to constantly be learning and
Mm.
constantly be iterating. I think for the people who think, okay, I'm going to figure this out once and then I'm going to have my system and my process. And, to your point about like for people who haven't seen yet, to hear you say, oh, I'm stagnating on Instagram, it doesn't really work for me anymore. On my side, I laughed because I'm like, what do you mean? You have 165,000 people on your Instagram, but you're aware of the
And
fact.
you know what? I bet you 99% of those people don't even know they're following me anymore.
Well, that's
And,
fair.
and clicked the follow button 7 years ago because they liked some little video or something,
Yeah,
and I'm just not showing up on their radar anymore at all. So I'll bet you, no, I've got a very small number of those people who actually like what I do and continue to come. And luckily, it's enough to make a living out of. But yeah, honestly,
exactly.
that 165K, whatever, it's rubbish. It's nonsense. I
Mhm.
know for a fact they're not bots. So that's because that was never a problem for me.
That's
And I didn't
important.
suddenly buy it. You could buy them in the old days. I mean, is that still?
Oh, you still can. I get so many bad direct message requests of like, do you want to grow? Do you want to like all these terrible? Oh yeah, you still can
Oh, they all accumulate in my little. There's a little section, isn't there, called it's like
request.
request, but hidden request. What
Yep.
it's called? Yeah, but I
Yep.
every now and again, I see there's hundreds in there. I don't even read them, but they're yes, okay. They're all selling that,
They're
are
all
they?
there. Yep. They're all
Still
bots.
selling.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
Okay,
like
anyway,
that to the point of it though, like realizing being self-aware enough to say, okay, there's a plateau happening here. And do you want to put in the effort to fix that plateau or is it time to change? And that's going to be a decision you have to decide on in order to keep being seen by people, in order to keep selling your work, in order to keep having the life that you want to have instead of, well, darn it, like digging your heels in and saying, well, the good old days are gone. It sucks.
oh right, yeah, yeah. I see what you're saying. Yes, yeah. It's not comfortable being self-employed at all. You never sit still, and you never get a chance to relax or say, "Well, yeah, this is the thing I do now." Or maybe you can. I don't know. I haven't done it long enough. I mean, I've been doing this 5 years, so maybe in 10 years, 20, 30, 40 years, I can finally say, hey, this is what I do now. But I suspect not, because that's just not the way my brain works. Yeah, and Instagram's stuck around for a surprisingly long time compared to other platforms which have come and gone. So maybe it's a fairly permanent fixture of our landscape now. I don't mean it's not working for me anymore. What I mean is I'm not that bothered about it anymore. I don't crave the likes and the followers anymore. And it's lovely when they happen and people, sometimes I'll put a reel out and all of a sudden it'll get reposted by somebody huge and I'll get a few hundred new followers or thousands or something. That's very lovely, but it's no longer a driving force for me. I've grown up about it. I'm a bit more of an adult as far as that social media thing goes. And I don't do any other things like Facebook or even YouTube really. I started a YouTube channel, but I've got to refigure out how to use it better because what I'm finding, I'm really frustrated. I'd like to teach more online. I'd like to do some, here's what I do. Here's how to fix this thing. Here's to make a very large vase, whatever it is. But I just have so little time to do that compared to making stuff.
That was actually my next question to ask you then is that balance of time, because it is from the outside looking in, at least what I'm seeing in actively following you on Instagram and still seeing your stuff, it doesn't seem to be the driving force of time in terms of, for somebody like we just keep referencing Florian here. Somebody's gonna have to reach out to, like, this is the Freudian way of being like, you like to please come on the
Just to make it
podcast.
absolutely clear, sorry, just to make absolutely, Florian makes absolutely beautiful work as well. I mean, that's what's so fantastic about his stuff is that he's cracked the social media thing. That's separate from the fact that he makes really lovely work as well. And most people don't get to hold a potter's work because they only make a few compared to other arts. And it's absolutely beautiful work. So he's an exception, and we should be careful of using exceptions to learn from.
That's true. And also from the outside looking in, from my perspective, he has two full-time jobs at this point, right? His
Yes,
content creation. And from photo perspective, I can see the videos he's putting together and see the amount of time those
yes.
compilation videos, especially all the various angles, which are either multiple cameras or are moving the same camera over and over the course of time and days and the process. And that is a lot of time and work.
It
And
is,
then
yes.
he's also making and selling work in a very full-time aspect. And what I'm seeing from the content that you're also producing is there is a consistency. There's a consistency of what you're putting out there, but there's maybe not that same balance of social media is part of the gig in the same way.
It's not. It isn't for me. No. I'm an old guy. I've been around the block, and I don't need to. Don't get the buzz from that. That maybe I would do if I were younger. I'm busy trying to seriously learn to do something well, and it takes me a lot of time and thought to do that. And I haven't, as I say, I haven't been through the training that maybe I could have done. So I've got to do a lot of self-reflective thinking and working. And a good example was that pot today that collapsed on me. It took 6 hours to make, and I cut it in half, of course, and I was very pleased with the profile. Very nice and even, lovely. But the top piece just didn't work, and there was something wrong with it. And I still haven't quite figured out what it was. And that takes me a lot of time, and I just can't be bothered to show everybody else what's going. It's enough for me to learn what I'm doing, to watch what I'm doing, to think about it. And I don't think it's fair to show everybody else the rubbish that happens. And maybe they'd like that. Maybe that's the new Instagram for me, that all the bad stuff that I really don't understand, but still trying to do. I think I just don't get the same buzz that other people get from it. And I just haven't got that discipline, I suppose. Maybe I'm lazy and fearful in those kinds of ways. I could get the camera out more. I could do more editing. I could do more voiceovers. I could probably work out a process of tuition or something, and I probably will do. But I don't know. I've got other things to do as well.
I guess the question more for me is how that works pragmatically, because I think a lot of people right now feel like I have to do that in order to have enough people finding my work
Yes.
and purchasing my work in order to make a living,
And,
right? And
and
so I love and admire being able to separate those things and build a business that maybe isn't reliant on that in such an extreme.
so I'm being a bit disingenuous because when you've got 160,000 followers, you can afford to just say, "Oh well, sod it, I'm going to go to the beach." So that's not fair on everybody who hasn't got that many followers and is trying to build a following. And so let's take a step back. I would advise anybody who's doing anything visual for a living or wants to for a living to build up a serious Instagram account. There are things you should do and there are things you should not do. They're really well known. But you might as well take advantage of that amazing platform and that search tool that it has that lets the whole world find you. So whatever you do, however bad or good you are, or whatever stage you're at with your art, there'll be a certain number of people in the world who like it. And there'll be a certain number of those people who will buy it. And the thing you have to do is get those people to see what you do. And if you could get the whole world to see what you do, then those people will find you by definition. And if it's 5 people, so be it. If it's 5 million people, so be it. But Instagram is probably the best way for a visual artist for those people to discover you. So that's the way around it. You have to think, how do I get everybody in the world to see what I'm doing so that the ones who really like it will say, yes, I'll give you $10 for that or $1,000 or whatever it is. And maybe you can make a living from that. But if you don't do that, so if you don't take those platforms seriously, Instagram especially, then you will have a very hard time. You are already deeply embedded in whatever it is you do, and you're a well-known artist, having done 30 or 40 years of work, and you're with various galleries and whatnot. Then that's fine. You don't need to worry about it. But if you're starting or your career isn't going as well as you hoped it would, then there's nothing more powerful at the moment than having a consistent Instagram presence. And anybody who's doing interesting looking work and who has something to say about it, that's quite important actually. I think, in my opinion, and looking at enough accounts, when you post something on Instagram, it's almost nobody will understand what it's about compared to what you think of it because you did it. It's your thing. So what you have to do, what's really important for you to do is to explain to people why they should like it or why they should take any interest in it or why they should even buy it. And that's where the caption comes in.
I'm gonna make you say that one more time because people have to listen to these things, right? And I'm like, no, say it again.
Apparently this is important, so everybody. Again, Instagram has lots of little bits to it. I mean, it's far more than when it started. It's just so confusing now. I mean, thank goodness they dropped half the things. I think IGTV has gone all the way it's gone. But there's still loads of little bits like tags and search and this. You've got this page. What is the homepage? You've got this homepage and that homepage. There's all sorts of things going on in Instagram, but there's only 2 you need to worry about. Well, actually, there's 3 you need to worry about. So let's deal with the first one. It's not so important. Tags are really important. Copy the best tags from other people and use those. That's out of the way.
Easy.
The 2 most important things, the 2 most important things for your account on Instagram are the image That's pretty obvious. That's the whole point of Instagram. But the caption, for goodness sake, you're allowed to write hundreds of words. And if you don't explain why someone should be interested in the caption, they probably won't be. You need both. Hardly anybody makes such stunning images that everybody's immediately attracted to them. There are photographic accounts where that's true, of course, but that's, they're photographing something pretty anodyne, like some canyon or forest or something or other. It's, who cares? And yet, oh, another tree, great. But if you're doing anything at all that's visual and it means something to you, then it probably doesn't mean that much to other people yet, especially if you're starting out. So it's totally incumbent on you to tell them why they should be interested. And that's about explaining your feelings about the thing, explaining your woes about the thing. Why didn't it go well? What's wrong with it? What don't you like about it? What's joyful and fantastic about it? What are people saying about it? What do you feel about it that brings that image to life? And unfortunately, most people just flick through their list of images and yes, like. But enough people are sensible enough to slow down a little bit, and they will read captions, especially if the first line is at all intriguing. And I strongly urge everybody to explain to us all why what you're doing is worth doing. And in doing that, you will engender people's feelings of empathy about it. They'll get to see why these things are important to you. And they might even start to agree with you. And a few of them will say, hey, you know what? I'd like that in my house. I like what she's doing here. I think that makes total sense to me. That really rings true because she's explained it to me. I can't stand going into galleries where you see some crazy, not even crazy, some really boring thing on the wall in some art gallery or on the floor or on the ceiling. And they haven't bothered to tell you what it's for, what it's about, or where it came from, or where it sits in the canon of their work, or anything like that. They're cutting off their noses to spite their faces just to try and be cool. There we go again, trying to be cool by not explaining it. And it just drives me nuts, because why should I be able to understand that with something you've been thinking about for decades and I haven't? So you need to tell me what's going on there. I could give you a quantum physics paper and it wouldn't be fair on you. I assume you haven't done any quantum mechanics, but I assume
Can't say that I have. No.
it wouldn't be fair on you to say, well, what do you make of that then? No, I'm not going to tell anything about it. Just read it and tell me what you think. So that doesn't happen in other fields, but it seems to happen in art a lot. And I think it's very cruel on your audience to not bring them in. In a small way, you can do that on Instagram. That's all I'm trying to say.
Well, and especially particular to ceramics, more than any other art form, from my perspective. So I was a musician before I was a photographer. I was a photographer, and now I'm still a photographer, but would much rather spend more time on the wheel. And particular to any other medium, there are so many complex levels of what goes into even the most basic beginner potter being able to give you a mug that you can put one or maybe two fingers through a handle and pick up and maybe hopefully drink some water out of. That in and of itself is so complex just from the very beginning, let alone as you excel through this craft. And it kills me from a marketing perspective, from the pragmatic side of it, for people to not explain to others how difficult that was, what they did have to, because then when you go to charge $50 for a mug, $100, 100 euros, pounds, whatever currency, more than the general store down the street, the likelihood of someone giving so much pushback. I mean, there's some people who just are not your people. They were never going to buy your stuff. Move
That's
on.
right.
Don't worry about it. Do not change your prices because you could sell it for a single dollar, euro, pound, and it still wouldn't matter to them. Move on. But
Mm.
there's a certain percentage of people who are on the fence, who are like, well, this is beautiful and I like it, but I don't quite understand. And then when you do explain that complexity, or you explain why you love it, or you explain all the myriad of levels that you just described, they go, oh, wow, yes, here's my credit card. Like without thought, right? And that makes it, that takes a lot of the, I don't know, what is it, the softness of art out of it. That takes, the way I just phrase it makes it sound a little bit cold. But at the end of the day, without marketing sales, you can't buy groceries or buy more clay to continue doing your art and your passion.
I see what you're saying. I think, well, pitching that same thing to people as, look, you have an emotional reaction to this thing you're making or learning. How about letting other people in on that? Maybe that's all you need to do. And that's all, because as everything else flows, as you say, from that, which is some of those people will get it better than they did. Some of those people might hand over some money to own that thing because now it means so much more to them than it did before. Sometimes the opposite happens, where very frequently actually I'll sell a piece of work to someone and they'll come back to me and explain what it was that they saw in it or wanted it. And it's absolutely nothing to do with what I intended or saw in the thing myself. And that's really interesting when something like that just that object has two completely different perspectives, mine and theirs, that have nothing in common because our lives have nothing in common. But somehow this one object has triggered something in both of us. And I really like that. It happens quite a lot, and I'm sort of thinking that through because but that's the means to us making a living. Is they have to have a reaction to the thing that is deep enough. They want to possess it, but you do need to tell people where you're coming from with everything you do, if you want them to be sympathetic enough to listen and then possibly to buy something.
Oh my goodness. Apparently, we should have slotted 5 hours for this conversation because there are so many other places. I'm very conscious of the fact that I am over here on this side of the computer sending out messages to people seemingly randomly on the internet and saying, would you like to give freely of your time so that I can record it and give it freely to other people? And so I don't like to take too far of advantage with each time, but I will 100% have you back. Absolutely.
Absolutely, there's a lot more to talk about.
There is so much more to talk about. So just to give a pause in the conversation for people for now and then moving forward, is there something that you feel like you wish people would kind of know? For most of the people presumably coming to the podcast, aside from my mom and a few of her friends, most people are makers and are in various stages, or maybe still are working that other job and that other profession and hobby making and trying to figure out how to make this more of their life. Is there something that you wish people would either know about how you're making it work or something you wish you would have known before you took that leap?
So this is very trite to say, but everybody's experience is probably unique. My experience is my experience, and I've got previous experience from my previous life before I went into this. So again, that's unique. I think there's loads of practical things. I mean, many practical things about the fluctuation of income and dealing with suppliers, galleries, and all those sorts of things. But I don't think that's what you're after, is it? It's something about, what is it? You call me on the hop here, but I'd say it's something that everybody always says, and it's the biggest thing to negotiate in a way, which is that if you find out what people want to buy, you're in great danger of making those things for them. And I think you should be very careful or very wary of that danger, because it's very dangerous. And if you make something that you want to make and nobody else buys it, nobody wants it, probably, this is maybe a bit harsh, but probably it's just not good enough yet. Rather than being so weird and amazing and it's way ahead of its time that nobody quite understands it, so they won't pay for it, it's much, much more likely that it just isn't good enough yet. And I emphasize the yet, and so, which is a sign, which is me saying, don't be in any way discouraged by that. Be excited by the fact that you haven't really understood the truth yet, but it's still there to be discovered. And when you find the truth, because you're a human being making something that means something to you, it will definitely mean something to somebody else. Because we're not that different from each other. We're not that sophisticatedly nuanced and differentiated that we can all respond to very similar things. So if you're making something that absolutely fits in what everybody else wants, you may well be making something really crap, like packets of crisps or plastic toys for children. If everybody wants it, it's probably meaningless. It's probably meaningless and probably quite harmful to the planet. So stop it immediately. If nobody wants it, it just means it's not good enough yet, but it can be. And if you're not making as much money as you need to live on for what you're doing, then you may well, because you are making enough, you probably are making the right thing, and it probably is well developed and well thought through, and you're doing. It's just that not enough people have seen it yet. So those are the three circumstances that you could find yourself in. And just to reiterate, because just for myself, having just thought of this, if no one's buying your stuff, it's probably not good enough yet. So work on it and get it to the point where it is. Test it, ask people, find out where you are in your stage of development. Definitely don't give up on it, because it means something to you. if you're selling out completely and everybody buys your stuff, absolutely everybody loves it, it's probably the wrong thing to be doing. And it's meaningless, pointless piece of rubbish. So stop it now. Do something more interesting. And if not enough people are buying your work because it's, and if not other people are buying your work to make a living out of yet, but they are buying it, then all it means is you just haven't reached them yet. So hop on Instagram, hop on whatever it is, YouTube or something, and tell us about what you're up to and why it's important. And we will all flock to you. And some of us will buy it.
For people who aren't a part of the 165,000, where can they find you on Instagram?
I mean, I have people who don't follow me.
I don't know. I just like to cover my bases just in case.
Well, for all you crazy people who've never heard of okay, so I'm on Instagram, as you may well have understood from this conversation. It's Tom_Kemp_. Because when I came to it, Tom Kemp had already, I tried, you try every combination, don't you? Tom.Kemp, Tom.Kemp, Tom.Kemp. They're all gone. So yeah, Tom_Kemp_ is me. I've got a sort of stagnant YouTube account. If you just search for Tom Kemp on YouTube, you'll find me. And one of the things on YouTube which I'm most proud of, is that there are 26 videos of me writing brush Roman capitals on my channel. Each one is written on a very hot day in the middle of London, so there's sirens and things going off, but it just shows you what I mean by full brush writing. You see what it's all about. Otherwise, feel free to email me or phone me or something. I'm happy to talk to anybody about anything.
Perfect.
I'm around.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for your time. Oh my gosh. I wish I would have planned another 4 hours, but we'll do it again soon.
Yeah, send me an invitation. I'll be right there.
And with that, we wrap up episode 312 here on the Maker's Playbook podcast. Now, you've heard us talk a lot about Instagram over the last few weeks, and it seems that a continuous theme as far as best practice goes, how to succeed, how to grow, the thing that every maker has said, whether side hustler or full-timer, is the necessity of consistency. Consistently showing up. But I know a lot of times consistency is hard, not only to say, but also to do, especially if you don't have a way to create photos and videos that you are actually proud of, not to mention having enough time to make them in the first place. And this is why I am so excited to say that we are preparing to open the doors to a new cohort of the Maker's photography styling system in just a couple of short weeks. You've heard me allude to it before, but the dates are actually set now. If you're listening along in real time, the exact date for the doors to open is going to be September 8th, 2022. But for those of you that are savvy and on our wait list, the doors will open over 1 week earlier on August 29th. This is an important thing to know because I have to limit the number of students we can take on for the course, as I am incredibly hands-on with all of the lessons and Q&A and direct feedback for everyone. So even though the fall is a crazy time of year for all things in the photography business, I wanted to make sure that we got this course out one more time this year, just in time for all of the newfound easy-to-implement systems you're going to be learning to be put to work for you leading up to those big holiday shop updates. I know how crazy the holiday time of year can get, so let's at least make one aspect of it a little bit easier, shall we? If you want to make sure you don't miss out, visit makersplaybook.com/waitlist-MPSS. Click the button to pop your email in, and you will be added to the waitlist. Now, that's a bit of a weird URL. makersplaybook.com/waitlist-MPSS. So you can also just open the detailed information of this particular episode on whatever podcast app you are listening to and click the link there. All right, my friends, as always, until next week, go get back to making your dreams a reality, because together we've got this.